Hey everyone, so look, here's the deal. We're going to be trying out a slightly different style of delivery. So I'm going to try and be a bit more conversational and a bit less man reads script. And to be honest with you all, that is going to take a little bit of what you might call basic preparation on my part. And I refuse to do that most of the time. So this is going to be a bit of a transition for me, but let's see how it goes. Have you ever noticed that certain journalists seem to be just repeating things they've been told with no critical thought about what exactly it is they're being told and no analysis of why they're being told these things? And doesn't that strike you as slightly different from what you might expect from journalism? Well, if you've watched the many videos on this channel which are remotely related to the press, no, it probably doesn't strike you as different at all or odd at all. But if you're new here, and if you are new here, like and subscribe, please. I need the likes and the subscriptions. It's the one thing that keeps me going these days. You might be coming here with an expectation of what journalism is, and that isn't matched by reality, at least in the UK. And I should say this is going to be focused, like all of my videos, on the UK, because as I keep having to point out, I have to live here. Oh, it's such a horrible thing to have to remember. Right. I should also point out that this video isn't going to be about bias as such, or it isn't going to be about the concept generally. It's really going to be about relationships and how those relationships can lead to specific kinds of bias. I think that there's plenty of material out there. If you want to learn about bias in the press, Tom Nicholas did a good video, The Myth of a Free Press, and the Liberal Cooks did a really good one on which is titled Journalism and Bias, if I'm remembering that right. If I'm not, oops. But also I'm gonna link them down below and you can check them out after this. Hopefully by the end of this video I should have explained and we should all be able to understand what the relationship is between a client journalist and what I call their patron, but you'll see why I call them that in a bit. I talk specifically about who some of the client journalists are, and yeah, I'm going to name some names and provide some examples, because while I do like to explain things as structures, this is kind of difficult to explain without looking at specific relationships to an extent, and how that becomes so corrosive and impacts how journalists do their jobs or don't do their jobs. Depends what you think their job actually is. I'll also try to figure out what can be done to solve it, or whether we can solve it, or should solve it. No, we should solve it, though. That sounds like we should probably do that. Sorry about making that sound uncertain. Let's just get moving. Move on.
Client journalism, a totally not mad guide.
So if you've ever had the misfortune of being trapped on Twitter.com and have the additional misfortune of being on any political part of Twitter, God, who is stupid enough to be like that? You've almost certainly seen a political journalist say words to the effect of, "No one tells me what to write." And I feel like this is important for me to say up front. I believe them. I really do believe them. I definitely do not think that Rupert Murdoch or whichever fucking ghoul owns the media outlet that you have in your mind sends a guy around with his instructions for the day. It just doesn't seem like an actual fucking thing that could possibly happen, right? And no one is actually accusing them of that, by the way. Like, they're making it up. They're just making it up. So the reason why this doesn't happen is, for one, they're not stupid, and no industry employs someone who requires that level of babysitting. It's better to have employees who understand what they need to do or write in order to get published. And you want a future in the industry you work in that isn't the equivalent of being banished to the shadow realm. So yeah, you're gonna you're going to feel out what can and can't get published. It's just the way it is. With the understanding that they're not receiving explicit orders or instructions on what to write or how to report, we need to figure out how journalists end up becoming clients, right? Because it's kind of a recurring theme on my channel to present the press as people who have power, or an institution that has power. That's because they do have power. They are powerful, right? Relative to, say, a typical YouTuber, or a freelance journalist, or probably you watching at home. If you're watching at home and you possess more power than the typical journalist, then why are you here, right? For one, don't go, but like, it seems a bit weird. But anyway, the only kind of person I could think of off the top of my head who would have more power than a typical journalist is like a member of parliament. In which case, if you are a member of parliament watching this, do a better job, probably. Although, to be fair, if you're watching this, there's some chance that you're one of the, like, 6 who do the job properly, so good job? I don't know. The press is made up of individuals, though, and there are some individuals who we might think are more guilty than others of being client journalists, or whose client journalism has more of an impact because they occupy a certain position, or they, are at a certain outlet, right? So we need to get to the bottom of what and why when it comes to the client-patron relationship. Incidentally, if you'd like to make me your client and be my patron, check out my Patreon. I hated that. I hated that so much. I didn't like how that happened. I don't know why I did that. I didn't even do it. I did it more than once. I'm not even going to admit how many times I ran that through. Because I've been watching HBO's Rome, great show by the way, definitely go watch it. So there was a producer note in my script, and by producer note I mean notes that I leave myself in massive capital letters that told me not to go on a big tangent about HBO's Rome. So if there was some kind of hard cut in there, maybe I went off on a tangent. Little one. Sorry, me who's editing. Hopefully you agree with what I said. But I've been thinking a lot about ancient Rome, and not in that weird everything in Rome was made out of marble way that you see from the weird statue people on twitter.com. There was a system of patronage in ancient Rome, which I think might be a helpful analogy for us to understand the relationship between client journalists and their patrons, especially because there are some interesting parallels that maybe we didn't expect. In ancient Rome, you would have a system of patronage, which had 2 roles, the client and the patron. Seems simple enough so far. This relationship could be between 2 people, a person and an organization, or a city. So, like the founder of a Roman colony and the colony itself would have a client-patron relationship between a Roman person and the client people. So Caesar did this with his Gallic allies, or even between the Roman state itself and other states. So like Rome and Ptolemaic Egypt, when one of the Ptolemies decided to let Rome inherit Egypt. Now that was off the top of my head. That's probably not right. If you're an actual historian, please do not correct that. I know that's probably not quite right. The kind of relationship that I want to focus on for this video is the relationship between people and the patron, who would have connections, influence, proximity to power, and a client who could use some of those things to help them out a little. So in ancient Rome, the client may, for example, want to start a business in the dye industry, and maybe they need to know where to get jars of piss from. Yes, that's how dye was made, by the way. Or they need access to credit, or really any of the things that you think you would need to get going in that industry. The patron who has taken the client under their wing uses their connections, influence, or wealth, or whatever else they have that the client doesn't have to help them. So that sounds like a pretty sweet deal for the client, right? Yeah, you have to swallow your pride and admit that you need help, but, that's a relatively cheap thing to have to give up in exchange for all of these potential advantages. And you might wonder, well, is the patron doing this out of the kindness of his heart? No, the patron would obviously get stuff out of it. So the obvious one is you would get prestige, right? Having a lot of very successful and competent clients under your guidance and patronage makes you look very cool and competent and good. And while there wasn't any legal obligation on the part of the client to return any of these favours to their patron, there was an element of good faith and loyalty at play between the two. And the client might be asked to do things at the patron's request. For example, if you were my client, you might be asked to go down to the Turkish shop that's just like down there. I don't know why I'm pointing, it's like you can see out my window, but the Turkish shop that's down there, and buy me some snacks. That's genuinely not that far off what some people might have been asked to do on behalf of their patrons. And this is particularly applied to freed slaves in Rome, but we'll just move forward. Genuinely, though, you could be asked to do errands like that. And generally speaking, out of gratitude to the patron, it would be done. It would happen. So another, and perhaps more relevant for our purpose, thing that a client could be asked to do is campaign on behalf of their patron if they or a political ally were running in an election. If you had a network of successful clients who had made their own fortunes or developed positive reputations, that's a pretty decent and quite powerful tool if you aspire to become consul. Although, to be fair, there were 2 consuls, so I feel like you've got a fair shot, given the typical caliber of person that you might be against. I should point out that as time went on, the institution of patronage loses its influence and might not really have been that influential in the first place, especially not on the election side of it, but it is a handy analogue to understand why some of our client journalists behave the way they do and what power they might actually hold in that relationship, since clients bring prestige or, dignitas, and no, I don't mean that dignitas, though. We'll move on. To their patron, they bring that to their patron with their success, and they actually provide a material base of support for the patron. So, returning to the modern day, that's one of the things that makes this relationship a bit more complicated than the relatively simple one of Roman patronage. The journalists, or the institutions they work for, they do actually have some power over their potential patrons, who could be politicians, businesses, or any other type of institution or individual with proximity to some kind of power or capital or anything like that. So for example, let's take Rumham impersonator Keir Starmer and animated used mop Boris Johnson. Both of them were, to an extent, propped up by different elements of the British press, with some suspicious overlap, but let's leave that to one side for now. Both were given favourable coverage, some might say unjustly, and they've both enjoyed periods of actual popularity, much to everyone's surprise, really, in one case. And yes, even Keir Starmer has managed it, even if he managed to, do the political equivalent of this.
It's time for the rake jump.
Do it!
And so through both Partygate and Beergate, and God, I fucking hate the gate suffix. It's played out. We need a new suffix, please. Please, someone in the comments below, come up with a new suffix for scandals, because I can't take this shit anymore. They've seen their popularity dented. Some might say more justifiably in the case of Boris Johnson than in the Ham case. But nonetheless, they both tried to curry the favour of outlets on the right, who often led the charge against both of them, really. The general theme of this channel, whenever I talk about the press in UK, is that it's powerful and it holds power, and whether you think it uses that power for good or evil, it's a separate issue, right? But it's also deferential to other centres of power. I'll remind you of the common statement of protest from a lot of journalists, which is that no one tells them what to write, and how that's because they intuitively understand what will and won't be published. Well, it's worth thinking about how that manifests and why. I should stress at this point that I'm primarily talking about the UK here. When I discuss how client journalism manifests, it is a thing that the specific process is UK. I'm talking about the UK, okay? There are definitely similar things that happen across the Anglosphere in America, and you might recognize some of the things I say here as covered by the term access journalism, but we'll see that client journalism emerges in the UK because of a few quite uncomfortable factors. At least they're uncomfortable if you believe that there should be integrity in this industry. Firstly, I want to note the ownership of the print media, and I'm focusing on the print media for a few reasons. One is that it's the part of the media that feeds into almost all of the other coverage, especially TV news in the UK, which is where most people are consuming their news. You know, they do those ridiculous paper reviews on the fucking 24-hour news networks. Why they do it? I don't know. I don't know what it adds to anything, but whatever. It's all part of the fucking human centipede of the British press. The second reason is that print media is relatively lightly regulated in the UK. Look, it's not a complete Wild West, but if it's in service to power, well, suddenly starts to look a bit more like a Wild West, and a lot of other things become permissible. The third reason is that some people, and a significant number of people, like proportionally, still for whatever reason seem to read print media either in the actual printed nonsense things that you see in the shops, where you can see their screeching headlines, or on the websites, and I don't know. I feel like we need to address that if it's feeding into so many other things and people are still reading it. But let's start doing that. All of that being said, some of the problems I highlight with print media do also apply to some TV news, or really any kind of journalism where this dynamic could exist, which is all of them, really. One way the client-journalism relationship manifests is in this simple fact. 90% of British print media is owned by free-holding companies, which doesn't exactly feel like the basis for a pluralist industry to begin with, but it gets worse when you look at some of the ownership behind these holding companies, because it's that group that everyone loves. It's billionaires, including Rupert Murdoch. You may have heard of him. Not a fan. So ownership structured in this way creates favourable conditions for client journalism, because that 90% doesn't just include our beloved national newspapers, known for their competence and fairness, but also local papers. So you have a whole ecosystem of people who, while it may not be made explicit with the men coming round to check your work, they do have to consider the editorial positions of their papers, which is inevitably impacted by ownership. And people act like that's such an insane thing to say, like ownership don't make decisions. Like, I don't know where these people work where ownership doesn't have some kind of decision-making power. But anyway, it sounds like more of a them problem than anything. Ownership alone doesn't quite explain the extent of the civility that we see from the UK's media. While the political preferences of ownership and editorial staff will inevitably push people to self-censor, especially in an industry that is as precarious as journalism, where staff roles aren't exactly great to begin with, and freelance gigs are, well, freelance gigs, if you've ever been one, you know what I mean. So what else could help us explain this relationship to power? For one, let's think about where politicians often go to for advisors. Journalists, and rather unsurprisingly given its capture by the right, BBC journalists a lot of the time are where they go for that sort of thing. And that's a powerful draw, right? Like, especially when you consider the context of insecure, low-paid employment in the industry for all but a select few, the prospect that if you play the game properly, you might be able to land a job working comms for one of your patrons or one of your patrons' friends sounds kind of like that old Roman system when I put it like that, actually. This doesn't just hold for politicians and how they're reported on. It's any kind of center of power, right? So you could talk about big business, even big businesses that advertise in these papers, which would look like a slight conflict of interest, but who's to say? Who am I to say anything about that? You'll see dipshits like failed towel folder and most coked up man alive George Osborne reinvent themselves by taking on senior roles in journalism, which, you know, is cool, I guess, and totally fine. Not a sign of an industry that's too deferential and connected to established power, at all. Then comes the phenomena of the anonymous source. I love anonymous sources, they're my favourite thing in the world to talk about. We'll be talking about that in more detail later, perhaps, but this is where some of that famed access journalism comes into play. If you don't report on what your anonymous source says, and usually your anonymous source is likely to be a well-placed person, well, good luck getting more information ahead of time if you're not printing what they say. I mean, Dominic Cummings, who has made it into some kind of folk demon in his own way, even though he looks like a mix between Jeff Bezos and Megamind, or at least wishes he was a mix between the two, I think, said that he could basically send whatever he liked to the BBC's political editor at the time, Laura Kuenssberg, and she'd just publish it, which is insane, but we'll definitely be talking about the BBC's political editor at that time later. But we need to think of a deeper why here, because it's all well and good to say you won't get your exclusive info anymore, but why does a journalist need to be first rather than accurate? Or at least risk being fed inaccurate or selectively interpreted information over and over again? It's our good old friend, the social medias. They're back! Now, I do defend social media a lot, primarily because I'm a creature created by it, in a way. We're really getting the gang back together for this video, aren't we? Since the industry itself is precarious, it kind of pays to have a social media presence, right? And look, I have a social media presence and it literally pays, so I'm not judging. One way to build yourself up is to have these connections and get these anonymous briefings. It's one way to both remain in your patrons' good graces and actually give you the reputation required to keep on failing upwards, or at least failing horizontally once you approach your ceiling. And I've mentioned one, but I wanted to get into some more specific examples of client journalism, including naming some names and providing some examples, so let's buckle up and see what happens. It might get messy, who knows?
Who are the client journalists?
So usually in these videos, I don't like to make it about specific people. Yeah, we'll go and find some tweets from dipshits and point at them and go, look at these fucking stupid people. But like, I try my very best not to blame them specifically for the problem. And I do that for a couple of reasons. One is that blaming individuals for systemic issues, it doesn't actually lead to any actual solutions to problems or provide a helpful way of thinking about problems. And the other is it's just not very interesting to me, at least not usually. This video may be a bit different, because we're gonna go from individuals and work our way up to the structure. At least that's kind of what I'm hoping to do. It might not come out like that by the end of the video. So yeah, I'm gonna act like it's the individual's fault here, because there is a truth to this idea that if you do have a platform, you have an obligation to use it sensibly, and I want you to decide whether these people in the positions that they occupy are doing that. And you are free to decide whether you believe they've done that or not. I also want to speculate why people in these positions are behaving the way that they do. Is it the person? I think it might at least partially be the person. The position, the organization, the process of how they came to be in that position. If you can't tell, I might already have some thoughts, but let's work through it all and see what we come up with. So let's look at some of these examples and see what we can learn about who the client journalists are and what exactly their status as clients does to their work. So let's look at one incident that stood out in the sort of golden age of client journalism, the 2019 UK general election. God, I fucking hate it, but let's look at the example.
It was Matt Hancock's advisor, J.N. Joku Goodwin, who was whacked in the face by a protester as he tried to help Hancock into his car outside Leeds General Hospital. Police on scene. All sounds very unpleasant. Today is getting nasty. Matt Hancock's special advisor has been allegedly punched by a flash mob of Labour-supporting activists outside Leeds Hospital. The Health Secretary had been dispatched there to deal with the fallout over 4-year-old Jack Wilmot Barr. Conservatives say Labour paid for taxis to transport around 100 activists to Leeds General Infirmary to protest against the Health Secretary's visit. They say a Conservative political advisor was assaulted outside the hospital. So Matt Hancock was dispatched to Leeds Hospital to try and sort out mess. Hearing Labour activists scrambled to go and protest, and it turned nasty when they arrive. One of them punched Hancock's advisor.
Those of you who aren't from the UK, or even some of you who might not be terminally online, first of all, you lucky fuckers, you might be going, well, what's the problem? This sounds like a serious thing that's happened, and they're just reporting on it. That'd be a really good point, actually, if this was a thing that actually happened, rather than a totally made-up event by the Conservative Party. So why might they be inclined to make shit up, or just repeat completely made-up shit? In the case of neo-Nazi conspiracy theory spreader Tom Newton-Dunn, I think we can safely say that he might have a motivation in lying about the left to benefit a Tory party that's practically aligned with the kind of organisations he liked to put on his front page when he was doing that kind of thing. Just check out his Wikipedia page. Oh yeah, you know it's going to be good when you see far-right conspiracy incident on the content. Very average British journalist of him. The other three in that image, they're broadcasters. Laura Kuenssberg in particular had attracted controversy for her conduct in her role from 2015 onwards, while Robert Peston is just kind of brilliantly stupid. Though a tendency to generate controversy in a perfectly childlike mind are kind of symptoms and not causes. So let's take a particular look at Laura Kuenssberg and see whether we might be able to learn something. So, who is Laura Kuenssberg, right? Like, if you're not from the UK, you won't know. So she is the outgoing BBC political editor. Now, you've probably heard of the BBC. It's kind of a big deal around these parts, and I guess in the Anglosphere. At least I assume it is. That might be some rare British exceptionalism showing, which given the last video is an interesting tack for me to take. The point is, why would someone who's working for an ostensibly impartial organisation be willing to repeat a falsehood without checking it and then ignoring it, and maybe her source was just wrong, or telling people that this source, who is clearly partisan, had just tried to lie to her? Well, one factor is that the BBC depends on something called the licence fee, which, if you don't know, is this levy that people are coerced into paying by vaguely threatening letters. Now, I work a day job, which I think might surprise some of you for some reason. Like, I get comments on every video that are caught by the filter where they're like, go get a job, and I'm left wondering what exactly it is you think I do between 8 and 4:30, which is when I work. The point is, it's not in my interest for my employer to stop making money, because I like getting paid even if the job is not, getting to do nothing all day. And, well, if my employer's source of income depends on the government letting them do these things, I might think twice about pissing them off. Though, you do wonder whether that did them any good with the news around the BBC and its licence fee. So, I don't know. There's also this spectacular case from that same election with this insane question posed to Angela Rayner. So let's check out this insane question that drove me mad.
But would you nationalise sausages? No.
Again, I'm going to say it again. This is clearly fucking insane, right? And while it's easy to chalk it up to an incompetent journalist who doesn't have a grasp on the topic that they were discussing, and if I recall correctly, this was an election debate on climate change, I want you to think about the context of the question and what it implies. Nationalisation is an economic policy that exists in virtually every country on Earth today, but rightly or wrongly, some people think that nationalising food processors is beyond the pale. You know who doesn't like nationalising anything? The government in the UK, which is run by Tories, and Angela Rayner's party is the primary opposition to... Right. So in this case, I put the blame more on the organisation being a client to power than any specific fault of these individuals, though I'd like to speculate a little based on the typical background of a journalist whether they might just be fucking Tories. Now, there's no such thing as a purely impartial journalist or person. It simply doesn't exist, and that's not anyone's fault. You are not at fault for believing in things. I think that's fine. But take a look at where some top journalists went to school and the backgrounds of politicians in Parliament, and well, you might suspect something's up.
51% of leading journalists educated and working in the UK in 2015 were privately educated, according to the social mobility think tank the Sutton Trust. Another 30% went to grammar schools, while 19% went to comprehensives. Looking at the same group of people, the Trust also found that 54% went to Oxford or Cambridge University. Conservative MPs elected at the 2019 general election were the most likely to have attended a fee-paying school, 44% compared to 38% Liberal Democrat, 19% Labour and 8% SNP.
With the percentage for politicians in the Conservative Party and among top journalists so similar, you might be forgiven for drawing conclusions. Now, going to private school and going to Oxford or Cambridge doesn't make you a fucking Tory. It doesn't inherently do that. It does maybe make you much more likely to be one. It might simply be the case that they support the Tories and are unable to stop it from leaking into their reporting. To take a slightly non-party political example, let's take a look at some sports journalism. I don't usually talk about sports, but let's even though I did a whole video on sports, but let's power through. And let's look at how this particular journalist reacted to two similar instances of sports washing, which, if you don't know, is the process of laundering your reputation through involvement in sporting ventures. One involving a team that he's paid to cover that was used as a sport washing entity by a largely Western aligned group of people, and another that he's not paid to cover that's used as a sport washing entity by someone else.
You might see sports washing, but what Newcastle see is togetherness, unity, hope and joy. A team that has won 6 home games in a row under a brilliant manager, Eddie Howe, who introduced team photos after every victory. You might think it's weird, but you must also accept it's working. Being told I'm subhuman for suggesting Chelsea fans really shouldn't be singing songs celebrating and praising the recently sanctioned Vladimir Putin power ally, Roman Abramovich, is when you see the power of sports washing.
And the thing is, he's not wrong in the second instance. It's just interesting, as it is with our party political examples, when and where people have clear eyes about what they're dealing with. Just in case you thought the client-patron relationship was just an issue on the right or for football clubs, here's a very, very good left of centre, let's pretend, example from an obnoxiously shit front page. I mean, for one, this is a hilariously bad picture of the least photogenic man in the world. This is from the paper who's supposed to support him. Anyway, I mean, it's certainly a bold play to just roll the dice the way the reanimated Rumham has chosen to, but come on now. No one could seriously play it up to this extent, right? Or at least treated seriously. I mean, oh my god. One of the interesting things here is who all these instances were in the interest of. You might think that in a field like journalism, the only real benefactors should be our understanding of the issues of the day and the holding of power to account. But let me ask you this. Do you think that's what's happened in those examples? Now, that's not an exhaustive set of examples. This happens all the fucking time. But do you think, you at home in the comments, tell me, do you think that's what's happened here? And I don't like to give credit to weird dipshits who think they're big-brained, but liberal folk devil Dominic Cummings just said the quiet part out loud about the relationship between the owners of the press and our elected government.
You can only understand the working from home farce if you understand this is an issue the trolley gets direct repeated calls from newspaper proprietors, not just editors. It's killing us. Tell us what you want in return, but you must get commuters back. Since April 2020.
And that's actually such a bold and clear admission of the client-patron relationship that it's kind of insane that the Prime Minister's former top advisor is just saying it. Though he's just saying it because he knows the press won't pick up on it. I mean, not no effect. I mean, it's appeared in this video, I guess, but I'm not the press. I don't have that force multiplier to work with to make something a story. There's also those who have an interest outside the world of the Tory party and government who want to shape the opposition, and so position themselves as client to the Labour Party, which, if you think about it, is kind of the most pathetic thing that you could be, but this is all in aid of burying the possibility of systemic change usually, so certain British journalists will stoop to any level if it means they get to do that. So here we have an example from Rachel Keirmouth, as she's been taken to being called, a mouthpiece for the evil of centrism in the UK.
Labour is expecting to lose Hull, where the Lib Dem opposition have been picking up support. Big Corbynite presence in the Labour group.
Just an absolutely pathetic attempt to cover for the fact that the Project Her paper, and let's be honest, most centre-left journalists back just isn't gaining any traction around the country. I remember a time when all failures were the fault of the people at the top. A fish rots from the head down after all. Funny how things change when it's your patron under attack, isn't it? So while I would chalk a lot of this down to a combination of cowardice and incompetence, it's always worth remembering that there are large portions of self-interest and political interest at play too. So that leaves us with quite a big question.
Can we solve it?
So the solution to all this is actually quite simple. Arrest all the client journalists. Okay, I'm obviously joking. Otherwise that would be one hell of a heated Erdogan moment. That's obviously not an actual solution to the problem, so everyone just... it's okay. And it's not an actual solution to the problem because it doesn't actually address the issues at play. So let's see what we could conceivably do and whether there are any examples we can follow elsewhere that isn't Erdogan style, even if I'd maybe kind of enjoy it in a kind of cheap way. So we can't just arrest them all and throw them in jail. Fine, so we're going to need to look for alternative solutions. And while I don't often like to take examples from the Great Satan itself, the Liberal Cooks video on the media did make a good point about American print media and how it behaves in theory, and that there's often a physical separation between the ad men at the newspapers and the journalists. And what's the impact of that? Well, it means that journalists who don't know who the paper's potential sponsors, or patrons if you like, are, they're not incentivized to report favorably towards them. The thing is, that works great for advertisers because you can at least like conceivably hide who they are in a credible way. You can't hide who the Prime Minister is. I mean, I guess you could, but that's gonna impact the quality and relevance of your reporting. So what do you do about the relationship with politicians? Separate the editorial stuff? I mean, I guess. But you can't stop people from texting each other or tweeting. I mean, perhaps bring in a law to stop senior journalists from taking roles in politics ever. But I mean, there'd end up being so many loopholes, so maybe that's too blunt a tool. Also, I'm not really a great fan of the government banning people from certain jobs. That tends to not, you know, have a great history. And when we throw in the broadcast element, it's even harder because despite the fact that the broadcast media is at least supposed to be better regulated in the UK, you can't really stop someone from coming onto Sky News and just being really fucking stupid. Or you can't really account for the quality of interviewers, or the interviewee for that matter. I mean, that nationalised sausages thing is still ringing in my head. I suppose you could try to decouple political TV news from covering the newspapers, but I can't really see what news channel would invest in a reporting department big enough or competent enough to fill the gap without falling into similar issues. You also can't stop people from having dipshit opinions, which, you know, I guess that's kind of like what I'm doing here. But once again, everyone has their bias, right? We're only humans, and unless we're gonna have people interviewed by perfectly impartial AIs with NFTs for faces, then we're gonna have to accept that there's a ceiling and a limitation on what we can do. God, I am not looking forward to that NFT AI idea becoming real now that I've said it. This is all especially bad when you consider that a lot of journalists are simply paid to be shit at their jobs, and if your livelihood relies on you being a drawling fucking idiot, then I doubt you're gonna do much to make yourself smarter or more competent. What I'm getting at here is, while there's a lot of really quite common sense things we can do to alter this situation and make it hypothetically more normal, not like that, what it really requires is a change in culture, one that really can't be forced on an industry by legal means or by us screaming the obvious at it. So I guess it's a tiny bit futile, at least without a willingness to organise our criticisms in a way that might have impact and might gain traction with people in the industry. This is made worse by the pressures that social media puts on journalists. The pressure to be first, which is probably a significant contributing factor to what happened with those tweets about the Phantom Punch. Also, the perceived need for access to politicians and sources means that you'll have a hard time instituting cultural change, even if that cultural change would have the potential to revive an industry that's losing circulation and rescue the reputation of a profession that is less trusted than estate agents and landlords. Which, when you think about what estate agents and landlords do, is kind of fucking insane, right? Though they're at least beating politicians and advertising executives, so, you know, although in fairness it is quite literally the job of one of those to lie to you all the time, and I will not be specifying which one. So solving the problem hypothetically seems to be possible, right? But once we think about the pressures facing the journalists themselves, the ownership structure, the powerful allure of the client-patron relationship itself, and let's be honest, the inertia within any industry when confronted with a need to change, it's really clear it's a big challenge, right? So what's the takeaway for all of us from this video? I suppose I've got to find something for us to take away, so let's go see if I figure that out.
Concluding thoughts.
When I reflect on these videos, in general, right, I try to point at some things that we could do, at least in the abstract, as something to take away from it all. To me, this is one of those ones where I really can't think of something overarching which you should take away from this, right? Other than to generally tell you all it's completely legitimate to inspect the relationship between those who have power and those who we hypothetically trust to hold power to account, there is this tendency, and it does exist, to dismiss this sort of thing as conspiratorial or crankery. And yes, there are people who imagine literal smoke-filled rooms where shady deals take place. And that, by the way, can happen. Most of the time, I think it's self-interest, their own biases, relationships, and an element of cowardice. And while it might be tempting to say, well, the solutions to this are, you know, we should build parallel structures to this that are viewer-funded, so that our patrons are always those who consume our media. That kinda, like, it can fall into the same traps. Look, there are plenty of projects that attempt that model, and you're free to go look at those, look them up, and see how they've panned out, and see whether they have, in fact, fallen into some of the same traps that these other things have fallen into, the mainstream has fallen into, if you like. So we need to think carefully in a way that's kind of impossible to do on a dipshit's YouTube video about what the implications of this are. Is it, we must never trust any journalist again? I don't think so, but it might well be a helpful thing to do. I don't know. I don't know, everyone. The answer is, to be honest, I don't know. Sometimes it's soothing to point at something that you see and have other people look at it and go, yeah, that's actually a thing. And sometimes that's enough of a conclusion. And we'll see whether the problem is one that solves itself. I think it's not. But let's see. So I want to thank my proofreaders, that's Mick Wright and my partner, and I want to thank the people who have lent their lovely voices to this video. I'm going to put my cards on the table here and say I have not finalized the full list as of recording, so if you want to know who those people are, check out the description. I will link to all of their very cool things down below. I also have to do the YouTuber thing of saying like and subscribe, please. It would be very good of you to do that. I appreciate all interaction in that way. Leave comments below, tell me whether I'm right or wrong, how nice my shirt looks, how messy my hair is, whether I should shave, get a job, whatever you like. People, just say whatever you like to me. But I do have to thank the patrons who do, you know, they make this worthwhile. You know, they really do, like, give me the energy I need to continue doing this. And speaking of the patrons, I promised people I would stop doing the wall, but some people, but they're going to appear here. There you go. There's the patrons, and I want to say a special thank you to Drone Riff, Mercutio, Nauseum, and Kazi Scheider. Thank you, in particular, as top tier patrons. If you would like to face the wall, be on the wall, now, there's no really good way or elegant way to describe that. I'm going to have to find a different way to display patrons eventually. But if you would like to be displayed... No, that sounded even worse. Look, if you would like to be credited with being one of the fantastic people who make this worthwhile for me, check out the Patreon, it'll be in the description. Otherwise, everyone, it is an unusually beautiful day for this part of England, so I'm going to wrap up, and I will catch you all in the next video or on my stream, twitch.tv/SK the Crusader. Take it easy, everyone. See you soon.